Look, greetings everybody from Gadigal lands in Sydney, and a great opportunity to connect with some members of the Lean Network to encourage your good efforts and to recognise some of the good things that you've been able to do already. To you, Louise, and your other colleagues, Felicity and others. Watch it from a distance, but I'm definitely there in spirit. The purpose of me speaking to you tonight is to bring you up to date with one of the most important environment campaigns that we've witnessed in Australia in the modern era, and that's no exaggeration, and that is the campaign around the protection of the Jabiluka site, which exists in the Northern Territory within the Kakadu National Park, on the alligator floodplain, where Aboriginal people have been in occupation for the greatest recorded period in Australia's pre-settlement history. And in doing that, to highlight to you in political terms the decisions that are awaited by the Northern Territory and the federal government, and the sort of support that I think it's very important for Lean to provide to the caucus and to the ministers for a decision to be made that brings this issue of Jabiluka and the threat of uranium mining there to a satisfactory conclusion for once and for all. I'll give you a bit of a background for the issue for some of you who may not be across the details, or perhaps will remember it vaguely from that period of time, depending on your date of birth. And in doing that, of course, very happy to pick up on any questions that people may have afterwards. But let's just set the scene. When the area of the alligator floodplain and the escarpment country that we know as Kakadu was first identified in the 50s as an area of substantial mineral riches, but particularly uranium deposits, but also other mineral riches, it became evident over time that that area also contained other important and pre-existing values. The first, the occupation by First Nations there. The second, the extraordinary environmental importance of that region as a whole. A Royal Commission was entered into to consider that matter and came up with what we might describe, or an inquiry, I think it might have been, the Fox inquiry, came up with what we might describe as a political solution, a compromise solution. And that was Kakadu National Park should be created, but that three particular ore deposits, uranium mining deposits, ought to be excised in effect from the park, and leases granted that enabled the mining of those sites. Those three areas were the Ranger, where the Ranger uranium mine was in fact started, Koongarra, and Jabiluka. The uranium mine at Ranger was begun with opposition from local Aboriginal clans, Aboriginal leaders, from non-government organisations, including the Australian Conservation Foundation. And my first involvement with that issue took place when I was president of the ACF. Fast forward to a period of time when the Ranger uranium mine life is running out, and the threat for the lease at Jabiluka to be given effect to arises. The Jabiluka lease now is held by a mining company called Energy Resources of Australia, otherwise known as ERA. The majority shareholder in ARA is the mining giant Rio Tinto. But in the mid to late 90s, following decisions taken by the Howard government, mining company announced that it wanted to begin work at Jabiluka. And in fact, work did start, preliminary works. And it was that time when Jabiluka became essentially a household name. A number of people became involved in that campaign. It became an extraordinary grassroots campaign. Many, many people travelled from all parts of Australia, but particularly from Melbourne and the southern cities. And there was a blockade at Jabiluka. And the Jabiluka opposition was led by the senior traditional owner, Yvonne Margarula, with other members and Aboriginal people at that time. And that campaign became international in scope and resulted successfully in a decision taken ultimately for the mine not to proceed, for the small amount of works that had been done there to be remediated, and the majority shareholder, Rio Tinto, stating publicly that it would not support any effort to mine at Jabiluka so long as traditional owners remained in opposition, which they have from that time. So the development was halted in the early 2000s. And since that period of time, the lease that was in existence has sat there. If we fast forward to today, as I said, the adjacent uranium mine at Ranger has ceased production and now is under rehabilitation. And I'll come to that very briefly in a second. You might be asking, and some of you may remember, what happened to the third of the mining deposits, Koongarra? And what happened with Koongarra is that I took a decision when I was serving in the Rudd government as Environment Minister to incorporate Koongarra into the Kakadu National Park on the basis that the lease hadn't been executed and the Commonwealth had an opportunity and relevant powers to undertake that step. That was concluded by my then colleague, Tony Burke, who you would know now, Minister of Industrial Relations, Leader of the House et al. And Koongarra became a part of Kakadu National Park. And it happened there, I have to say, because the traditional owner of Koongarra was very, very keen for that to take place as well. Aboriginal people in the Kakadu region have always opposed uranium mining. They've had to deal with one uranium mine, Ranger, which has had a litany of problems over time. Part of its operations involves discharging radioactive wastewaters into the floodplains of the surrounding area. And there are significant and serious issues around its ongoing rehabilitation. But equally, with the Jabiluka lease, the mining company that holds that lease has now made an application for the lease to be extended for another 10 years. The lease would conclude in August of this year and run its course. If the lease were not to be extended, then there's no obstacle to Jabiluka being incorporated into Kakadu National Park with the free, prior and confirmed consent of Aboriginal people and traditional owners. And that is the wish of Yvonne Margarula and the Mirrar people, who are the clan holders upon whose country Jabiluka rests. So that's the situation that we've faced, and the call is one for the Commonwealth to make clear that it sees Jabiluka's future as one which is for the site to be within Kakadu National Park, and for Minister King and the Northern Territory Minister not to extend this lease for 10 years, which they're under no legal requirement to do so, as far as I'm aware. So that's the nub of why I'm addressing you today. So take that as a summary of where we're at. And it's our hope, those of us that have been working with Mirrar, that Lean and the Federal Party will respond and that the government will do the right thing. Having said all of that, let me now expand my comments to you a little bit more to provide you with some additional context as to why this is so critical, why the history of what's happened here is so relevant to today, and why the timing is so urgent. So I spoke about how there was a Fox inquiry into what should happen in the Kakadu region. Aboriginal people were opposed to the idea that there should be mining of any sort in the region, but particularly uranium mining, with the significant risks that it provides to environment. That one uranium mine got off the ground, Ranger, that ran its course, that the other two leases that had been excised, one a Labor government was able to ensure became part of Kakadu National Park, and Jabiluka is the last lease standing. Now, I said that I had involvement when I was ACF president in Kakadu and on the campaigns around both Ranger, which was opposed at the time, and then later Jabiluka. But I also went on to the blockade at the end of the 90s to spend time there with many campaigners, with Yvonne Margarula and her family and community. And including in that campaign is someone whose name some of you will remember, Tommy Wren, a former Labor minister. And Tom and I campaigned at Jabiluka, and as did other members of the party, including, I think from memory, some state ministers, who could see that the time then had surely come for this lease to be incorporated back into the park, given that that was the wishes of Yvonne Margarula and the traditional owners. Now, colleagues, remember that Kakadu is, if it's not our biggest, it's our second biggest national park, but it's certainly our most important. The primary occupation by First Nations people there is literally recognised on the Jabiluka site itself. Majid Bebi is the site that has been identified as showing the oldest signs of occupation in rock shelter on the continent. 65,000 years. That's where that 65,000 year figure comes from. It comes from the site that is on the Jabiluka mining lease. Jabiluka is World Heritage, Kakadu, I beg your pardon, the national park itself is World Heritage listed. It's World Heritage listed because it has outstanding universal values, cultural, with prior Aboriginal occupation, and current occupation, and because of its natural values, an extraordinary large area containing massive biodiversity, bird species, fish species, lizard species, an extraordinary floodplain. It's an internationally recognised for the rocks art sites that are at Kakadu. Some of you will know Norlangi Rock, Aboriginally known as Barangoi. It's a place where tourists go to. It's the place that the Northern Territory government puts on all its brochures and on its websites. Kakadu is the jewel in the crown of World Heritage Sites in Australia. And it is for that reason that this campaign is of such significance. The Jabiluka site exists alongside other sacred sites at Jabiluka. The Boyweek Almudge sites. These are places which have got such unique, important and internationally recognised significance. But more important than that, they're significant to the people whose predecessors are buried there, are celebrated there. It's their continuing undisturbed occupation until these leases that were created that lies at the heart of Mirrar and Yvonne Marigaraula's opposition to the Jabiluka mining lease. So, given that the lease is up for renewal in August, but does not have to be renewed, and given finally one other point for your edification, colleagues, and that is that the mining company involved in holding the lease, Energy Resources of Australia, doesn't have the capacity to mine Jabiluka. It doesn't really even have the capacity to continue its proper rehabilitation of Ranger next door, and its major shareholder, Rio, has had to come in and become part of the management of the rehabilitation of the mine next door. In its own annual report, it points to its financial vulnerabilities. Its share price is low as a consequence. Its major shareholder has said that it will not approve or permit mining to go ahead if traditional owners are still opposed. Traditional owners themselves have reiterated their opposition as recently as January and February of this year to Prime Minister Albanese, Minister King, Minister Plibersek, and the Chief Ministers of the Northern Territory. So there's now no reason at all why the Albanese government can't take the next step and rule out any extension of this lease for a site that is never going to be mined and will never be approved by traditional owners. And importantly and significantly, allow Yvonne Marigaraula, who for all of her adult life has been campaigning against uranium mining on her country, finally see its protection happen in her lifetime. So that's where we're at with this particular issue, and you can tell that I feel pretty strongly about it, but I'm sure all of you would understand why and hopefully share that view.
Peter,
one final observation in the midst of all of this, which is of a political nature. I have always wanted to, and in my term in government tried to, I've always wanted to see and believe that we can better protect our natural environment and increase our capacity to have good, respectful, and consultative relationships with First Nations people Australia-wide. On the other side of the House, we have the Leader of the Opposition who's decided to hitch his star to the nuclear bandwagon. That inevitably means, amongst other things, that the pressure for additional uranium mining at some point is likely to take place. Labor has had, despite its free mine policy, a consistently strong view, both on honouring the wishes of Aboriginal traditional owners and additionally ensuring that areas of significant natural and cultural value ought to be protected. And there are heaps of examples of that that I won't go through tonight. but Kakadu is one of them. And yet Kakadu National Park still has this sore spot, this place of grief and suffering and anxiety and threat sitting within it. So the country's watching us and the world is watching us, and we believe now is most definitely the time for the Labor government, which we've elected to act, and to act responsibly, as we know they can, and we hope that they will. On that basis, I think I'm pretty much at the end of making a presentation to you, Louise. I could talk on a lot, but it feels to me like it's a good time to stop and see whether people have got some questions that have come through to you, and I'd be very happy to answer them. And if I can't quite find the answers, I'm sure that Kirsten Blair, who's with us, who's also working with the Mirrar, would be happy to give me that information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I don't know, actually, we've just been having chat messages that they're completely in support with what you've just explained to us, but I might take the lead, and everyone pop your questions in the chat. So with the decision on the lease, is it just the Minister for Resources, or does the Minister for Environment and the Prime Minister have a say? And do they have to consider things like the radioactive waste that's been going onto the floodplains? Like, what are the factors that they have to consider as whether to renew the lease?
So the decisions primarily at the Commonwealth end made by Minister King. It actually lies with the Northern Territory government in the first instance, but the Commonwealth has a number of significant legislative responsibilities that take in Kakadu. In this case, it's not the sort of decision that a minister, for example, an environment minister or a resources minister might have to make when there's something in place and there's a question as to whether its lifetime should be expanded, or whether a proposal that's already described in writing, with, you know, all the associated paperwork and consultants and department comments and so on and so forth, is in place. If that were the case, ministers would are bound by various legislation and responsibilities to consider various matters. But here, we're at one stage before, or well, more than one stage before that point, we're at a stage where it's just a lease. Mm-hmm. A lease granted initially, by the way, at the behest of the Crown, and not necessarily with the appropriate consents that should run for the Aboriginal people whose country it was. But just like if we had a bit of a look at a map of Australia, we can see that there are all sorts of leases that have been issued over all sorts of things, running alongside highways for paths, you know, next to shopping centres and so on and so forth. There are leases pretty much everywhere, and certainly mining leases over pretty much the whole of the country. Now, some of those are issued as a matter of course, as they must be, by relevant mining or industries departments in the states when an application's made, and some of them will have conditions that attach to it. But here it is just the Jabiluka mineral lease that's in existence at the moment. It doesn't have any other status. Now, the point about this is pretty straightforward politically and, if you like, morally. Government issues a lease to a party, leaving aside the question of the lease being on Aboriginal land, with a view to the lease being exercised and used for the good of the country. This lease hasn't been exercised or used. Its time's run out. So what possible arguments can be made for the lease to be continued? The short answer is that so long as there's uranium in the ground at the Jabiluka lease, and it is a small but rich ore body, then the mining company that holds the lease would seek to maximise its own commercial situation by maintaining that lease. notwithstanding the fact that its own major shareholder has said that they're opposed to the lease being utilised in that way, and notwithstanding the ongoing opposition of Mirrar. And finally, notwithstanding the statements that have already been made, sympathetic to traditional owners, including by the Northern Territory Administration. So we're not in a situation where ministers have got to weigh up a whole lot of things at all. It's really a political decision per se, which says that it's the gift of the government to determine, or both governments, whether in their view they believe the lease should be extended for another 10 years. And it's within their purview to say, given the situation as we see it, it doesn't have to be that case.
So can I ask a few more technical questions that have jumped into the chat? So Alan has asked, does an extended Jabiluka lease represent an asset for ERA so they can borrow against it for ranger rehabilitation? But can I add to that, there's one further up, which is saying what's to stop Rio Tinto from selling, and then there's no undertakings to consult with the traditional owners?
Let me deal with the second question first. That's both good questions. So there's nothing to stop a mining company selling its interest in another company. And if that were the case and the lease were extended, there would be then nothing to stop whoever that interest was sold to, whether it was to ERA or then on sold to others, from seeking to exploit the lease. So that's the first, that's the answer to the second question. And I think the first question was, would ERA be able to utilise the lease in such a way as to pay for the rehabilitation of Ranger? Is that the, I think that was, yeah.
Yeah, like an asset to borrow against.
So here's the problem that we can't really ignore at all. It's only a 10-year lease. And one would think, and this is me making this comment not as part of my formal presentation, but just as an observation, that the lease extension exists in the first place to enable the works that were undertaken or intended to be undertaken when the lease was first granted to be concluded. In other words, had there been a mine there, had the mine been in operation, and had it got 7/10 of the way through its operation, then there would need to be an extension clause to enable it to finish what it started doing. And that makes sense. I might not agree with it in this case because I don't think that Jabiluka should be mined, but that would be the rationale. That's not the case here. It would be extremely difficult for ERA, given that it does not have a capital raising sufficient to enable it to utilise the mine, to put the infrastructure in place, to go through the approvals processes, to undertake something of that significance within the period of time that a renewal of the lease would allow.
Yeah.
And at this point in time, going to the question of the rehabilitation of Ranger, and so I don't want to spend too much time on that, although it's a really good question, because quite often, understandably, people, I'm not talking about everyone else on the webinar, but people can get the two things a bit confused, what's going on here and what's going there. One is just literally a paper lease over a prescribed area. That's Jabiluka. The second is a uranium mine, Ranger, which has concluded its life and now needs to be rehabilitated. But the question is a good one because one mining company owns both of those things or runs both of those things. So it's pretty obvious that on the question of rehabilitation, there are really significant challenges for Ranger. And I'll just quickly run you through the figures. In 2018, the rehabilitation was, estimate was at around $800 million for the rehabilitation. In 2022, it had gone to about $1.6 billion. In that same year, 2022, I do know that Mirrar wrote to Ministers Plibersek and Minister Burney noting this matter and asking that the Jabiluka mining lease be permanently protected. By 2023, that rehabilitation figure had gone to $2.2 billion. And in its 2023 annual report, ERA noted that it might not be able to continue to function as a company with its existing operations, which include the rehabilitation. And subsequent to that, Rio Tinto, its major shareholder, agreed that it would come in to help manage the rehabilitation process. So any income in a hypothetical or revenue that was likely to be generated were Jabiluka ever to be mined, which it will not be, would emerge way down a mysterious long track in the future and not be able to be provided for the immediate needs for the rehabilitation of Ranger.
Yeah. So Peter, and keeping an eye on time before we go to our next special guest, who I believe has joined us in the background, there's a couple more questions if I could ask. One, I mean, I guess the big question is it writing to Minister King and Plibersek and the Prime Minister? What is the action that you think would help, put pressure on the government to take this moral and political decision? But then the other question was a quick one, a technical one from David Mason, is there required to be just compensation Commonwealth? Oh, Wayne, mute yourself. If there was to be no renewal of the lease.
So the first part of your question is, a number of us, people like myself and others who've been close to this campaign and working on it for decades, feel very strongly that the Mirrar traditional owners who campaigned successfully with our support to have the mining stopped at Jabiluka should now be given that final gift, that sign of respect and a sensible policy decision as well, and see a government that supported both Indigenous interests and recognised the importance of Kakadu National Park being the brilliant place of cultural and natural value by not renewing the lease. There are no questions around that matter other than Lean, both formally, you, Louise, and other office bearers, and Lean members would, I hope, be very keen to communicate to both the Prime Minister, particularly Minister King and Minister Plibersek. They are in possession of the correspondence that Mirrar have been able to send over time, which details much more than I have in this webinar, the issues, including the relevant legal issues and matters around whether there are any potential issues that the questioner raised in terms of compensation. Remember, it doesn't arise in this case because it's just a lease. Nothing's happened. It's only a renewal of a lease that's being sought. And what better sign, what better symbol for a progressive Labor government, federal Labor government, to show both its ongoing respect and support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, an understanding of what Yvonne Maragarula herself has been through for all her adult life, a repudiation of some of the nonsense that we hear from political opponents, and a sign that the government indeed is listening and can take this step in concert with the Northern Territory government, who would be potentially formally the ones to take a decision, but it must be done with them talking to each other at this point of time in the cycle and at this point in time in our history.
Thank you. That's given us a huge outline. What I will do is obviously share this video for those who could not make it tonight. Peter, thank you very much for your time. And I did want to say to people, unfortunately, Corbin couldn't join us tonight from the Mirrar, but you kind of represented everything that perhaps we would have said anyway.
Well, look, no worries, Louise. I know you've got a special guest coming now, and I'll get out of the way. I'll say g'day to him.
You're our first special guest. We've got 2 tonight. We're particularly lucky.
Yeah, but we've been really mindful that we're campaigning for the interests of traditional owners. They have never wavered on this issue, and it's now time for us to support them.
Yeah, hear, hear.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. Cheers, Wayne.